Chapter 43 of The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 3 nights after this she took Pansy to a great party, to which Osmond, who never went to dances, did not accompany them. Pansy was as ready for a dance as ever. She was not of a generalising turn, and had not extended to other pleasures the interdict she had seen placed on those of love. If she was biding her time, or hoping to circumvent her father, she must have had a prevision of success. Isabel thought this unlikely. It was much more likely that Pansy had simply determined to be a good girl. She had never had such a chance, and she had a proper esteem for chances. She carried herself no less attentively than usual, and kept no less anxious an eye upon her vaporous skirts. She held her bouquet very tight, and counted over the flowers for the 20th time. She made Isabel feel old. It seemed so long since she had been in a flutter about a ball. Pansy, who was greatly admired, was never in want of partners, and very soon after their arrival she gave Isabel, who was not dancing, her bouquet to hold. Isabel had rendered her this service for some minutes, when she became aware of the near presence of Edward Rozier. He stood before her. He had lost his affable smile, and wore a look of almost military resolution. The change in his appearance would have made Isabel smile if she had not felt his case to be at bottom a hard one. He had always smelt so much more of heliotrope than of gunpowder. He looked at her a moment, somewhat fiercely, as if to notify her he was dangerous, and then dropped his eyes on her bouquet. After he had inspected it his glance softened, and he said, quickly, "It's all Pansy's. It must be hers." Isabel smiled kindly. "Yes, it's hers. She gave it to me to hold." "May I hold it a little, Mrs. Osmond?" the poor young man asked. "No, I can't trust you. I'm afraid you wouldn't give it back." "I'm not sure that I should. I should leave the house with it instantly. But may I not at least have a single flower?" Isabel hesitated a moment, and then, smiling still, held out the bouquet. "Choose one yourself. It's frightful what I'm doing for you." "Ah, if you do no more than this, Mrs. Osmond," Rozier exclaimed with his glass in one eye, carefully choosing his flower. "Don't put it in your buttonhole," she said. "Don't for the world." "I should like her to see it. She has refused to dance with me, but I wish to show her that I believe in her still." "It's all very well to show it to her, but it's out of place to show it to others. Her father has told her not to dance with you." "And is that all you can do for me? I expected more from you, Mrs. Osmond," said the young man in a tone of fine general reference. "You know our acquaintance goes back very far, quite into the days of our innocent childhood." "Don't make me out too old," Isabel patiently answered. "You come back to that very often, and I've never denied it. But I must tell you that, old friends as we are, if you had done me the honour to ask me to marry you, I should have refused you on the spot." "Ah, you don't esteem me then. Say at once that you think me a mere Parisian trifler." "I esteem you very much, but I'm not in love with you. What I mean by that, of course, is that I'm not in love with you for Pansy." "Very good. I see. You pity me, that's all." And Edward Rozier looked all round, inconsequently, with his single glass. It was a revelation to him that people shouldn't be more pleased, but he was at least too proud to show that the deficiency struck him as general. Isabel for a moment said nothing. His manner and appearance had not the dignity of the deepest tragedy. His little glass, among other things, was against that. But she suddenly felt touched. Her own unhappiness, after all, had something in common with his, and it came over her more than before that here, in recognisable, if not in romantic form, was the most affecting thing in the world, young love struggling with adversity. "Would you really be very kind to her?" she finally asked in a low tone. He dropped his eyes devoutly, and raised the little flower that he held in his fingers to his lips. Then he looked at her. "You pity me, but don't you pity her a little?" "I don't know. I'm not sure. She'll always enjoy life." "It will depend on what you call life," Mr. Rossiter effectively said. "She won't enjoy being tortured." "There'll be nothing of that." "I'm glad to hear it. She knows what she's about. You'll see." "I think she does, and she'll never disobey her father. But she's coming back to me," Isabel added, "and I must beg you to go away." Rosa lingered a moment till Pansy came in sight on the arm of her cavalier. He stood just long enough to look her in the face. Then he walked away, holding up his head, and the manner in which he achieved this sacrifice to expediency convinced Isabel he was very much in love. Pansy, who seldom got disarranged in dancing, looked perfectly fresh and cool after this exercise, waited a moment, and then took back her bouquet. Isabel watched her and saw she was counting the flowers, whereupon she said to herself that decidedly there were deeper forces at play than she had recognised. Pansy had seen Rosa turn away, but she said nothing to Isabel about him. She talked only of her partner, after he had made his bow and retired, of the music, the floor, the rare misfortune of having already torn her dress. Isabel was sure, however, she had discovered her lover to have abstracted a flower, though this knowledge was not needed to account for the dutiful grace with which she responded to the appeal of the next partner. That perfect amenity under acute constraint was part of a larger system. She was again led forth by a flushed young man, this time carrying her bouquet, and she had not been absent many minutes when Isabel saw Lord Warburton advancing through the crowd. He presently drew near and bade her good evening. She had not seen him since the day before. He looked about him, and then, "Where's the little maid?" he asked. It was in this manner that he had formed the harmless habit of alluding to Miss Osmond. "She's dancing," said Isabel. "You'll see her somewhere." He looked among the dancers, and at last caught Pansy's eye. "She sees me, but she won't notice me," he then remarked. "Are you not dancing?" "As you see, I'm a wallflower." "Won't you dance with me?" "Thank you. I'd rather you should dance with the little maid." "One needn't prevent the other, especially as she's engaged." "She's not engaged for everything, and you can reserve yourself. She dances very hard, and you'll be the fresher." "She dances beautifully," said Lord Warburton, following her with his eyes. "Ah, at last," he added, "she has given me a smile." He stood there with his handsome, easy, important physiognomy, and as Isabel observed him it came over her, as it had done before, that it was strange a man of his mettle should take an interest in a little maid. It struck her as a great incongruity. Neither Pansy's small fascinations, nor his own kindness, his good nature, not even his need for amusement, which was extreme and constant, were sufficient to account for it. "I should like to dance with you," he went on in a moment, turning back to Isabel, "but I think I like even better to talk with you." "Yes, it's better, and it's more worthy of your dignity. Great statesmen oughtn't to waltz." "Don't be cruel. Why did you recommend me then to dance with Miss Osmond?" "Ah, that's different. If you danced with her it would look simply like a piece of kindness, as if you were doing it for her amusement. If you dance with me you'll look as if you were doing it for your own." "And pray, haven't I a right to amuse myself?" "No, not with the affairs of the British Empire on your hands." "The British Empire be hanged! You're always laughing at it." "Amuse yourself with talking to me," said Isabel. "I'm not sure it's really a recreation. You're too pointed. I've always to be defending myself. And you strike me as more than usually dangerous to night. Will you absolutely not dance?" "I can't leave my place. Pansy must find me here." He was silent a little. "You're wonderfully good to her," he said suddenly. Isabel stared a little and smiled. "Can you imagine one's not being?" "No, indeed. I know how one is charmed with her. But you must have done a great deal for her." "I've taken her out with me," said Isabel, smiling still, "and I've seen that she has proper clothes." "Your society must have been a great benefit to her. You've talked to her, advised her, helped her to develop?" "Ah, yes. If she isn't the rose, she has lived near it." She laughed, and her companion did as much; but there was a certain visible preoccupation in his face which interfered with complete hilarity. "We all try to live as near it as we can," he said after a moment's hesitation. Isabel turned away. Pansy was about to be restored to her, and she welcomed the diversion. We know how much she liked Lord Warburton. She thought him pleasanter even than the sum of his merits warranted. There was something in his friendship that appeared a kind of resource in case of indefinite need. It was like having a large balance at the bank. She felt happier when he was in the room. There was something reassuring in his approach. The sound of his voice reminded her of the beneficence of nature. Yet for all that it didn't suit her that he should be too near her, that he should take too much of her good will for granted. She was afraid of that. She averted herself from it. She wished he wouldn't. She felt that if he should come too near, as it were, it might be in her to flash out and bid him keep his distance. Pansy came back to Isabel with another rent in her skirt, which was the inevitable consequence of the first and which she displayed to Isabel with serious eyes. There were too many gentlemen in uniform. They wore those dreadful spurs which were fatal to the dresses of little maids. It hereupon became apparent that the resources of women are innumerable. Isabel devoted herself to Pansy's desecrated drapery. She fumbled for a pin and repaired the injury. She smiled and listened to her account of her adventures. Her attention, her sympathy were immediate and active, and they were in direct proportion to a sentiment with which they were in no way connected: a lively conjecture as to whether Lord Warburton might be trying to make love to her. It was not simply his words just then, it was others as well. It was the reference and the continuity. This was what she thought about while she pinned up Pansy's dress. If it were so, as she feared, he was of course unwitting, he himself had not taken account of his intention. But this made it none the more auspicious, made the situation none the less impossible. The sooner he should get back into right relations with things, the better. He immediately began to talk to Pansy, on whom it was certainly mystifying to see that he dropped a smile of chastened devotion. Pansy replied as usual, with a little air of conscientious aspiration. He had to bend toward her a good deal in conversation, and her eyes, as usual, wandered up and down his robust person, as if he had offered it to her for exhibition. She always seemed a little frightened, yet her fright was not of the painful character that suggests dislike. On the contrary, she looked as if she knew that he knew she liked him. Isabel left them together a little, and wandered toward a friend whom she saw near, and with whom she talked till the music of the following dance began, for which she knew Pansy to be also engaged. The girl joined her presently with a little fluttered flush, and Isabel, who scrupulously took Osmond's view of his daughter's complete dependence, consigned her, as a precious and momentary loan, to her appointed partner. About all this matter she had her own imaginations, her own reserves. There were moments when Pansy's extreme adhesiveness made each of them, to her sense, look foolish. But Osmond had given her a sort of tableau of her position as his daughter's duenna, which consisted of gracious alternations of concession and contraction, and there were directions of his which she liked to think she obeyed to the letter. Perhaps, as regards some of them, it was because her doing so appeared to reduce them to the absurd. After Pansy had been led away, she found Lord Warburton drawing near her again. She rested her eyes on him steadily. She wished she could sound his thoughts. but he had no appearance of confusion. "She has promised to dance with me later," he said. "I'm glad of that. I suppose you've engaged her for the cotillion." At this he looked a little awkward. "No, I didn't ask her for that. It's a quadrille." "Ah, you're not clever," said Isabel, almost angrily. "I told her to keep the cotillion in case you should ask for it." "Poor little maid, fancy that!" And Lord Warburton laughed frankly. "Of course I will if you like." "If I like? Oh, if you dance with her only because I like it?" "I'm afraid I bore her. She seems to have a lot of young fellows on her book." Isabel dropped her eyes, reflecting rapidly. Lord Warburton stood there looking at her, and she felt his eyes on her face. She felt much inclined to ask him to remove them. She didn't do so, however. She only said to him, after a minute, with her own raised, "Please let me understand." "Understand what?" "You told me 10 days ago that you liked to marry my stepdaughter. You've not forgotten it?" "Forgotten it? I wrote to Mr. Osmond about it this morning." "Ah," said Isabel, "he didn't mention to me that he had heard from you." Lord Warburton stammered a little. I didn't send my letter." "Perhaps you forgot that." "No, I wasn't satisfied with it. It's an awkward sort of letter to write, you know. But I shall send it to night." "At 3 o'clock in the morning?" "I mean later, in the course of the day." "Very good. You still wish then to marry her?" "Very much indeed." "Aren't you afraid that you'll bore her?" And, as her companion stared at this inquiry, Isabel added, "If she can't dance with you for half an hour, how will she be able to dance with you for life?" "Ah," said Lord Warburton readily, "I'll let her dance with other people. About the cotillion, the fact is I thought that you. "That I would do it with you? I told you I'd do nothing." "Exactly. So that while it's going on I might find some quiet corner where we may sit down and talk." "Oh," said Isabel gravely, "you're much too considerate of me." When the cotillion came, Pansy was found to have engaged herself, thinking, in perfect humility, that Lord Warburton had no intentions. Isabel recommended to him to seek another partner, but he assured her that he would dance with no one but herself. As, however, she had, in spite of the remonstrances of her hostess, declined other invitations on the ground that she was not dancing at all, it was not possible for her to make an exception in Lord Warburton's favour. "After all, I don't care to dance," he said. "It's a barbarous amusement. I'd much rather talk." And he intimated that he had discovered exactly the corner he had been looking for, a quiet nook in one of the smaller rooms, where the music would come to them faintly and not interfere with the conversation. Isabel had decided to let him carry out his idea. She wished to be satisfied. She wandered away from the ballroom with him, though she knew her husband desired she should not lose sight of his daughter. It was with his daughter's pretendant, however. That would make it right for Osmond. On her way out of the ballroom she came upon Edward Rozier, who was standing in a doorway, with folded arms, looking at the dance in the attitude of a young man without illusions. She stopped a moment and asked him if he were not dancing. "Certainly not, if I can't dance with her," he answered. "You had better go away then," said Isabel, with the manner of good counsel. "I shall not go till she does." And he let Lord Warburton pass without giving him a look. This nobleman, however, had noticed the melancholy youth, and he asked Isabel who her dismal friend was, remarking that he had seen him somewhere before. "It's the young man I've told you about, who's in love with Pansy." "Ah, yes, I remember. He looks rather bad." "He has reason. My husband won't listen to him." "What's the matter with him?" Lord Warburton inquired. "He seems very harmless." "He hasn't money enough, and he isn't very clever." Lord Warburton listened with interest. He seemed struck with this account of Edward Rozier. "Dear me! He looked a well set-up young fellow." "So he is, but my husband's very particular." "Oh, I see." And Lord Warburton paused a moment. "How much money has he got?" he then ventured to ask. "Some 40,000 francs a year." £1,600? Ah, but that's very good, you know." "So I think. My husband, however, has larger ideas." "Yes, I've noticed that your husband has very large ideas. Is he really an idiot, the young man?" "An idiot? No, not in the least. He's charming. When he was 12 years old, I myself was in love with him." "He doesn't look much more than 12 to day," Lord Warburton rejoined vaguely, looking about him. Then, with more point, "Don't you think we might sit here?" he asked. "Wherever you please." The room was a sort of boudoir, pervaded by a subdued rose-coloured light. A lady and gentleman moved out of it as our friends came in. "It's very kind of you to take such an interest in Mr. Rozier," Isabel said. "He seems to me rather ill-treated. He had a face a yard long. I wondered what ailed him." "You're a just man," said Isabel. "You've a kind thought even for a rival." Lord Warburton suddenly turned with a stare. "A rival? Do you call him my rival?" "Surely, if you both wish to marry the same person." "Yes, but since he has no chance—" "I like you, however that may be, for putting yourself in his place. It shows imagination." "You like me for it?" And Lord Warburton looked at her with an uncertain eye. "I think you mean you're laughing at me for it." "Yes, I'm laughing at you a little. But I like you as somebody to laugh at." "Ah, well, then, let me enter into his situation a little more. What do you suppose one could do for him?" "Since I have been praising your imagination, I'll leave you to imagine that yourself," Isabel said. "Pansy, too, would like you for that." "Miss Osmond?" "Ah, she, I flatter myself, likes me already." "Very much, I think." He waited a little. He was still questioning her face. "Well, then, I don't understand you. You don't mean that she cares for him?" "Surely I've told you I thought she did." A quick blush sprang to his brow. "You told me she would have no wish apart from her father's, and as I've gathered that he would favour me." He paused a little, and then suggested, "Don't you see?" through his blush. "Yes, I told you she has an immense wish to please her father, and that it would probably take her very far." "That seems to me a very proper feeling," said Lord Warburton. "Certainly, it's a very proper feeling." Isabel remained silent for some moments. The room continued empty. The sound of the music reached him with its richness softened by the interposing apartments. Then, at last, she said, "But it hardly strikes me as the sort of feeling to which a man would wish to be indebted for a wife." "I don't know, if the wife's a good one, and he thinks she does well." "Yes, of course, you must think that." "I do. I can't help it. You call that very British, of course." "No, I don't. I think Pansy would do wonderfully well to marry you, and I don't know who should know it better than you. But you're not in love." "Ah, yes, I am, Mrs. Osmond." Isabel shook her head. "You like to think you are, while you sit here with me. But that's not how you strike me." "I'm not like the young man in the doorway, I admit that. But what makes it so unnatural? Could any one in the world be more lovable than Miss Osmond?" "No one, possibly. But love has nothing to do with good reasons." "I don't agree with you. I'm delighted to have good reasons." "Of course you are. If you were really in love, you wouldn't care a straw for them." "Ah, really in love! Really in love!" Lord Warburton exclaimed, folding his arms, leaning back his head, and stretching himself a little. "You must remember that I'm 42 years old. I won't pretend I'm as I once was." "Well, if you're sure," said Isabel, "it's all right." He answered nothing. He sat there, with his head back, looking before him. Abruptly, however, he changed his position. He turned quickly to his friend. "Why are you so unwilling, so sceptical?" She met his eyes, and for a moment they looked straight at each other. If she wished to be satisfied, she saw something that satisfied her. She saw in his expression the gleam of an idea, that she was uneasy on her own account, that she was perhaps even in fear. It showed a suspicion, not a hope, but such as it was, it told her what she wanted to know. Not for an instant should he suspect her of detecting in his proposal of marrying her stepdaughter an implication of increased nearness to herself, or of thinking it, on such a betrayal, ominous. In that brief, extremely personal gaze, however, deeper meanings passed between them than they were conscious of at the moment. "My dear Lord Warburton," she said, smiling, "you may do, as far as I'm concerned, whatever comes into your head." And with this she got up and wandered into the adjoining room, where, within her companion's view, she was immediately addressed by a pair of gentlemen, high personages in the Roman world, who met her as if they had been looking for her. While she talked with them, she found herself regretting she had moved. It looked a little like running away, all the more as Lord Warburton didn't follow her. She was glad of this, however, and at any rate she was satisfied. She was so well satisfied that when, in passing back into the ball-room, she found Edward Rozier still planted in the doorway, she stopped and spoke to him again. "You did right not to go away. I've some comfort for you." "I need it," the young man softly wailed, "when I see you so awfully thick with him." "Don't speak of him. I'll do what I can for you. I'm afraid it won't be much, but what I can, I'll do." He looked at her with gloomy obliqueness. "What has suddenly brought you round?" "The sense that you are an inconvenience in doorways," she answered, smiling, as she passed him. Half an hour later she took leave, with Pansy, and at the foot of the staircase the two ladies, with many other departing guests, waited a while for their carriage. Just as it approached, Lord Warburton came out of the house and assisted them to reach their vehicle. He stood a moment at the door, asking Pansy if she had amused herself, and she, having answered him, fell back with a little air of fatigue. Then Isabel at the window, detaining him by a movement of her finger, murmured gently, "Don't forget to send your letter to her father." Chapter 44 of The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. This recording is in the public domain. The Countess Jaimini was often extremely bored, bored, in her own phrase, to extinction. She had not been extinguished, however, and she struggled bravely enough with her destiny, which had been to marry an unaccommodating Florentine who insisted upon living in his native town, where he enjoyed such consideration as might attach to a gentleman whose talent for losing at cards had not the merit of being incidental to an obliging disposition. The Count Jaimini was not liked even by those who won from him, and he bore a name which, having a measurable value in Florence, was, like the local coin of the old Italian states, without currency in other parts of the peninsula. In Rome he was simply a very dull Florentine, and it is not remarkable that he should not have cared to pay frequent visits to a place where, to carry it off, his dullness needed more explanation than was convenient. The Countess lived with her eyes upon Rome, and it was the constant grievance of her life that she had not a habitation there. She was ashamed to say how seldom she had been allowed to visit that city. It scarcely made the matter better that there were other members of the Florentine nobility who had never been there at all. She went whenever she could. That was all she could say. Or rather, not all, but all she said she could say. In fact, she wished to end her days in the shadow of St. Peter's. They are reasons, however, that do not closely concern us, and were usually summed up in the declaration that Rome, in short, was the eternal city, and that Florence was simply a pretty little place like any other. The Countess apparently needed to connect the idea of eternity with her amusements. She was convinced that society was infinitely more interesting in Rome, where you met celebrities all winter at evening parties. At Florence there were no celebrities, none at least that one had heard of. Since her brother's marriage her impatience had greatly increased. She was so sure his wife had a more brilliant life than herself. She was not so intellectual as Isabel, but she was intellectual enough to do justice to Rome. Not to the ruins and the catacombs, not even perhaps to the monuments and museums, the church ceremonies and the scenery, but certainly to all the rest. She heard a great deal about her sister-in-law, and knew perfectly that Isabel was having a beautiful time. She had indeed seen it for herself on the only occasion on which she had enjoyed the hospitality of Palazzo Roccanera. She had spent a week there during the first winter of her brother's marriage, but she had not been encouraged to renew this satisfaction. Osmond didn't want her. That she was perfectly aware of, but she would have gone all the same, for after all she didn't care two straws about Osmond. It was her husband who wouldn't let her, and the money question was always a trouble. Isabel had been very nice. The Countess, who had liked her sister-in-law from the first, had not been blinded by envy to Isabel's personal merits. She had always observed that she got on better with clever women than with silly ones like herself. The silly ones could never understand her wisdom, whereas the clever ones, the really clever ones, always understood her silliness. It appeared to her that, different as they were in appearance and general style, Isabel and she had somewhere a patch of common ground that they would set their feet upon at last. It was not very large, but it was firm, and they should both know it when they had once really touched it. And then she lived, with Mrs. Osmond, under the influence of a pleasant surprise. She was constantly expecting that Isabel would look down on her, and she as constantly saw this operation postponed. She asked herself when it would begin, like fireworks, or Lent, or the opera season. Not that she cared much, but she wondered what kept it in abeyance. Her sister-in-law regarded her with none but level glances, and expressed for the poor Countess as little contempt as admiration. In reality, Isabel would as soon have thought of despising her as of passing a moral judgment on a grasshopper. She was not indifferent to her husband's sister, however. She was rather a little afraid of her. She wondered at her. She thought her very extraordinary. The Countess seemed to her to have no soul. She was like a bright rare shell, with a polished surface, and a remarkably pink lip, in which something would rattle when you shook it. This rattle was apparently the Countess's spiritual principle, a little loose nut that tumbled about inside of her. She was too odd for disdain, too anomalous for comparisons. Isabel would have invited her again. There was no question of inviting the Count. But Osmond, after his marriage, had not scrupled to say frankly that Amy was a fool of the worst species, a fool whose folly had the irrepressibility of genius. He said at another time that she had no heart, and he added in a moment that she had given it all away, in small pieces, like a frosted wedding cake. The fact of not having been asked was of course another obstacle to the Countess's going again to Rome. But at the period with which this history has now to deal, she was in receipt of an invitation to spend several weeks at Palazzo Roccanera. The proposal had come from Osmond himself, who wrote to his sister that she must be prepared to be very quiet. Whether or no she found in this phrase all the meaning he had put into it, I am unable to say. But she accepted the invitation on any terms. She was curious, moreover, for one of the impressions of her former visit had been that her brother had found his match. Before the marriage she had been very sorry for Isabel, so sorry as to have had serious thoughts, if any of the Countess's thoughts were serious, of putting her on her guard. But she had let that pass, and after a little she was reassured. Osmond was as lofty as ever, but his wife would not be an easy victim. The Countess was not very exact at measurements, but it seemed to her that if Isabel should draw herself up, she would be the taller spirit of the two. What she wanted to learn now was whether Isabel had drawn herself up. It would give her immense pleasure to see Osmond overtopped. Several days before she was to start for Rome, a servant brought her the card of a visitor, a card with a simple superscription, Henrietta C. Stackpole. The Countess pressed her fingertips to her forehead. She didn't remember to have known any such Henrietta as that. The servant then remarked that the lady had requested him to say that if the Countess should not recognise her name, she would know her well enough on seeing her. By the time she appeared before her visitor, she had in fact reminded herself that there was once a literary lady at Mrs. Touchett's, the only woman of letters she had ever encountered, that is, the only modern one, since she was the daughter of a defunct poetess. She recognised Miss Stackpole immediately, the more so that Miss Stackpole seemed perfectly unchanged, and the Countess, who was thoroughly good-natured, thought it rather fine to be called on by a person of that sort of distinction. She wondered if Miss Stackpole had come on account of her mother, whether she had heard of the American Corinne. Her mother was not at all like Isabel's friend. The Countess could see at a glance that this lady was much more contemporary, and she received an impression of the improvements that were taking place, chiefly in distant countries, in the character, the professional character, of literary ladies. Her mother had been used to wear a Roman scarf thrown over a pair of shoulders timorously bared of their tight black velvet, oh, the old clothes, and a gold laurel wreath set upon a multitude of glossy ringlets. She had spoken softly and vaguely, with the accent of her Creole ancestors, as she always confessed. She sighed a great deal, and was not at all enterprising. But Henrietta, the Countess could see, was always closely buttoned and compactly braided. There was something brisk and business-like in her appearance. Her manner was almost conscientiously familiar. It was as impossible to imagine her ever vaguely sighing as to imagine a letter posted without its address. The Countess could not but feel that the correspondent of the Interviewer was much more in the movement than the American Corinne. She explained that she had called on the Countess because she was the only person she knew in Florence, and that when she visited a foreign city she liked to see something more than superficial travellers. She knew Mrs. Touchett, but Mrs. Touchett was in America, and even if she had been in Florence, Henrietta would not have put herself out for her, since Mrs. Touchett was not one of her admirations. "Do you mean by that I am?" the Countess graciously asked. "Well, I like you better than I do her," said Miss Stackpole. "I seem to remember that when I saw you before you were very interesting. I don't know whether it was an accident or whether it's your usual style. At any rate, I was a good deal struck with what you said. I made use of it afterwards in print." "Dear me!" cried the Countess, staring and half alarmed. "I had no idea I ever said anything remarkable. I wish I had known it at the time." "It was about the position of woman in this city," Miss Stackpole remarked. "You threw a good deal of light upon it." "The position of woman's very uncomfortable. Is that what you mean? And you wrote it down and published it?" the counsel went on. "Ah, do let me see it." "I'll write to them to send you the paper, if you like," Henrietta said. "I didn't mention your name. I only said a lady of high rank. And then I quoted your views." The Countess threw herself hastily backward, tossing up her clasped hands. "Do you know, I'm rather sorry you didn't mention my name? I should have rather liked to see my name in the papers. I forget what my views were, I have so many. But I'm not ashamed of them. I'm not at all like my brother. I suppose you know my brother? He thinks it's a kind of scandal to be put in the papers. If you were to quote him, he'd never forgive you." "He needn't be afraid. I shall never refer to him," said Miss Stackpole, with bland dryness. "That's another reason," she added, "why I wanted to come to see you. You know Mr. Osmond married my dearest friend." "Ah, yes, you were a friend of Isabel's. I was trying to think what I knew about you." "I'm quite willing to be known by that," Henrietta declared, "but that isn't what your brother likes to know me by. He has tried to break up my relations with Isabel." "Don't permit it," said the Countess. "That's what I want to talk about. I'm going to Rome." "So am I," the Countess cried. "We'll go together." "With great pleasure. And when I write about my journey, I'll mention you by name as my companion." The Countess sprang from her chair, and came and sat on the sofa beside her visitor. "Ah, you must send me the paper. My husband won't like it, but he need never see it. Besides, he doesn't know how to read." Henrietta's larger eyes became immense. "Doesn't know how to read? May I put that into my letter?" "Into your letter?" "In the Interviewer. That's my paper." "Oh, yes, if you like, with his name. Are you going to stay with Isabel?" Henrietta held up her head, gazing a little in silence at her hostess. "She has not asked me. I wrote to her I was coming, and she answered that she would engage a room for me at a pension. She gave no reason." The Countess listened with extreme interest. "The reason's Osmond," she pregnantly remarked. "Isabel ought to make a stand," said Miss Stackpole. "I'm afraid she has changed a great deal. I told her she would." "I'm sorry to hear it. I hoped she would have her own way. Why doesn't my brother like you?" the Countess ingenuously added. "I don't know, and I don't care. He's perfectly welcome not to like me. I don't want every one to like me. I should think less of myself if some people did. A journalist can't hope to do much good unless he gets a good deal hated. That's the way he knows how his work goes on. And it's just the same for a lady. But I didn't expect it of Isabel." "Do you mean that she hates you?" the Countess inquired. "I don't know. I want to see. That's what I'm going to Rome for." "Dear me, what a tiresome errand!" the Countess exclaimed. "She doesn't write to me in the same way. It's easy to see there's a difference. If you know anything," Miss Stackpole went on, "I should like to hear it beforehand, so as to decide on the line I shall take." The Countess thrust out her underlip, and gave a gradual shrug. "I know very little. I see and hear very little of Osmond. He doesn't like me any better than he appears to like you." "Yet you're not a lady correspondent," said Henrietta pensively. "Oh, he has plenty of reasons. Nevertheless, they've invited me. I'm to stay in the house." And the Countess smiled almost fiercely. Her exultation for the moment took little account of Miss Stackpole's disappointment. This lady, however, regarded it very placidly. "I shouldn't have gone if she had asked me. That is, I think I shouldn't, and I'm glad I hadn't to make up my mind. It would have been a very difficult question. I shouldn't have liked to turn away from her, and yet I shouldn't have been happy under her roof. A pension will suit me very well. But that's not all." "Rome's very good just now," said the Countess. "There are all sorts of brilliant people. Did you ever hear of Lord Warburton?" "Hear of him? I know him very well. Do you consider him very brilliant?" Henrietta inquired. "I don't know him, but I'm told he's extremely grand seigneur. He's making love to Isabel." "Making love to her?" "So I'm told. I don't know the details," said the Countess lightly. "But Isabel's pretty safe." Henrietta gazed earnestly at her companion. For a moment she said nothing. "When do you go to Rome?" she inquired abruptly. "Not for a week, I'm afraid." "I shall go to morrow," Henrietta said. "I think I had better not wait." "Dear me, I'm sorry. I'm having some dresses made. I'm told Isabel receives immensely. But I shall see you there. I shall call on you at your pension." Henrietta sat still. She was lost in thought. And suddenly the Countess cried, "Ah, but if you don't go with me, you can't describe our journey." Miss Stackpole seemed unmoved by this consideration. She was thinking of something else, and presently expressed it. "I'm not sure that I understand you about Lord Warburton." "Understand me? I mean he's very nice, that's all." "Do you consider it nice to make love to married women?" Henrietta inquired, with unprecedented distinctness. The Countess stared, and then, with a little violent laugh, "It's certain all the nice men do it. Get married and you'll see," she added. "That idea would be enough to prevent me," said Miss Stackpole. "I should want my own husband. I shouldn't want any one else's. Do you mean that Isabel's guilty?" And she paused a little, choosing her expression. "Do I mean she's guilty? Oh dear no, not yet, I hope. I only mean that Osmond's very tiresome, and that Lord Warburton, as I hear, is a great deal at the house. I'm afraid you're scandalised." "No, I'm just anxious," Henrietta said. "Ah, you're not very complimentary to Isabel. You should have more confidence. I'll tell you," the Countess added quickly, "if it will be a comfort to you, I engage to draw him off." Miss Stackpole answered at first only with the deeper solemnity of her gaze. "You don't understand me," she said after a while. "I haven't the idea you seem to suppose. I'm not afraid for Isabel, in that way. I'm only afraid she's unhappy. That's what I want to get at." The Countess gave a dozen turns of the head. She looked impatient and sarcastic. "That may very well be. For my part, I should like to know whether Osmond is." Miss Stackpole had begun a little to bore her. "If she's really changed, that must be at the bottom of it," Henrietta went on. "You'll see, she'll tell you," said the Countess. "Ah, she may not tell me. That's what I'm afraid of." "Well, if Osmond isn't abusing himself, in his old way, I flatter myself I shall discover it," the Countess rejoined. "I don't care for that," said Henrietta. "I do, immensely. If Isabel's unhappy, I'm very sorry for her, but I can't help it. I might tell her something that would make her worse, but I can't tell her anything that would console her. What did she go and marry him for? If she had listened to me she'd have got rid of him. I'll forgive her, however, if I find she has made things hot for him. If she has simply allowed him to trample upon her, I don't know that I shall even pity her. But I don't think that's very likely. I count upon finding that if she's miserable, she at least has made him so." Henrietta got up. These seemed to her, naturally, very dreadful expectations. She honestly believed she had no desire to see Mr. Osmond unhappy, and indeed he could not be, for her, the subject of a flight of fancy. She was on the whole rather disappointed in the Countess, whose mind moved in a narrower circle than she had imagined, though with a capacity for coarseness even there. "It will be better if they love each other," she said for edification. "They can't. He can't love any one." "I presumed that was the case. But it only aggravates my fear for Isabel. I shall positively start to morrow." "Isabel certainly has devotees," said the Countess, smiling very vividly. "I declare I don't pity her." "It may be I can't assist her," Miss Stackpole pursued, as if it were well not to have illusions. "You can have wanted to, at any rate. That's something. I believe that's what you came from America for," the Countess suddenly added. "Yes, I wanted to look after her," Henrietta said serenely. Her hostess stood there smiling at her with small bright eyes and an eager looking nose, with cheeks into each of which a flush had come. "Ah, that's very pretty. C'est bien gentil. Isn't it what they call friendship?" "I don't know what they call it. I thought I had better come." "She's very happy, she's very fortunate," the Countess went on. "She has others besides." And then she broke out passionately. She's more fortunate than I. I'm as unhappy as she. I've a very bad husband. He's a good deal worse than Osmond. And I've no friends. I thought I had, but they're gone. No one, man or woman, would do for me what you've done for her." Henrietta was touched. There was nature in this bitter effusion. She gazed at her companion a moment, and then, "Look here, Countess, I'll do anything for you that you like. I'll wait over and travel with you." "Never mind," the Countess answered, with a quick change of tone. "Only describe me in the newspaper." Henrietta, before leaving her, however, was obliged to make her understand that she could give no fictitious representation of her journey to Rome. Miss Stackpole was a strictly veracious reporter. On quitting her she took the way to the Lungarno, the sunny quay beside the yellow river, where the bright-faced inns familiar to tourists stand all in a row. She had learned her way before this through the streets of Florence. She was very quick in such matters, and was therefore able to turn with great decision of step out of the little square which forms the approach to the bridge of the Holy Trinity. She proceeded to the left, towards the Ponte Vecchio, and stopped in one of the hotels which overlook that delightful structure. Here she drew forth a small pocket-book, took from it a card and a pencil, and after meditating a moment wrote a few words. It is our privilege to look over her shoulder, and if we exercise it we may read the brief query: "Could I see you this evening for a few moments on a very important matter?" Henrietta added that she should start on the morrow for Rome. Armed with this little document she approached the porter, who now had taken up his station in the doorway, and asked if Mr. Goodwood were at home. The porter replied, as porters always reply, that he had gone out about 20 minutes before, whereupon Henrietta presented her card and begged that it might be handed him on his return. She left the inn and pursued her course along the quay to the severe portico of the Uffizi, through which she presently reached the entrance of the famous gallery of paintings. Making her way in, she ascended the high staircase which leads to the upper chambers. The long corridor, glazed on one side and decorated with antique busts, which gives admission to these apartments, presented an empty vista in which the bright winter light twinkled upon the marble floor. The gallery is very cold, and during the midwinter weeks but scantily visited. Miss Stackpole may appear more ardent in her quest of artistic beauty than she has hitherto struck us as being, but she had, after all, her preferences and admirations. One of the latter was the little Correggio of the Tribune, the Virgin kneeling down before the sacred infant, who lies in a litter of straw, and clapping her hands to him while he delightedly laughs and crows. Henrietta had a special devotion to this intimate scene. She thought it the most beautiful picture in the world. On her way at present from New York to Rome, she was spending but 3 days in Florence, and yet reminded herself that they must not elapse without her paying another visit to her favourite work of art. She had a great sense of beauty in all ways, and it involved a good many intellectual obligations. She was about to turn into the Tribune when a gentleman came out of it, whereupon she gave a little exclamation and stood before Caspar Goodwood. "I've just been at your hotel," she said. "I left a card for you." "I'm very much honoured," Caspar Goodwood answered, as if he really meant it. "It was not to honour you I did it. I've called on you before, and I know you don't like it. It was to talk to you a little about something." He looked for a moment at the buckle in her hat. "I shall be very glad to hear what you wish to say." "You don't like to talk with me," said Henrietta, "but I don't care for that. I don't talk for your amusement. I wrote a word to ask you to come and see me, but since I've met you here, this will do as well." "I was just going away," Goodwood stated, "but of course I'll stop." He was civil, but not enthusiastic. Henrietta, however, never looked for great professions, and she was so much in earnest that she was thankful he would listen to her on any terms. She asked him first, none the less, if he had seen all the pictures. "All I want to. I've been here an hour." "I wonder if you've seen my Correggio," said Henrietta. "I came up on purpose to have a look at it." She went into the tribune, and he slowly accompanied her. "I suppose I've seen it, but I didn't know it was yours. I don't remember pictures, especially that sort." She had pointed out her favourite work, and he asked her if it was about Correggio that she wished to talk with him. "No," said Henrietta, "it's about something less harmonious." They had the small brilliant room, a splendid cabinet of treasures, to themselves. There was only a custode hovering about the Medicean Venus. "I want you to do me a favour," Miss Stackpole went on. Caspar Goodwood frowned a little, but he expressed no embarrassment at the sense of not looking eager. His face was that of a much older man than our earlier friend. "I'm sure it's something I shan't like," he said rather loudly. "No, I don't think you'll like it. If you did, it would be no favour." "Well, let's hear it," he went on, in the tone of a man quite conscious of his patience. "You may say there's no particular reason why you should do me a favour. Indeed, I only know of one: the fact that if you'd let me, I'd gladly do you one." Her soft, exact tone, in which there was no attempt at effect, had an extreme sincerity, and her companion, though he presented rather a hard surface, couldn't help being touched by it. When he was touched, he rarely showed it, however, by the usual signs. He neither blushed, nor looked away, nor looked conscious. He only fixed his attention more directly. He seemed to consider with added firmness. Henrietta continued, therefore, disinterestedly, without the sense of an advantage. "I may say now, indeed, it seems a good time, that if I've ever annoyed you, and I think sometimes I have, it's because I knew I was willing to suffer annoyance for you. I've troubled you, doubtless, but I'd take trouble for you." Goodwood hesitated. "You're taking trouble now." "Yes, I am, some. I want you to consider whether it's better on the whole that you should go to Rome." "I thought you were going to say that," he answered rather artlessly. "You have considered it, then?" "Of course I have, very carefully. I've looked all round it. Otherwise I shouldn't have come so far as this. That's what I stayed in Paris 2 months for. I was thinking it over." "I'm afraid you decided as you liked. You decided it was best because you were so much attracted." "Best for whom, do you mean?" Goodwood demanded. "Well, for yourself first. For Mrs. Osmond next." "Oh, it won't do her any good. I don't flatter myself that." "Won't it do her some harm? That's the question." "I don't see that it will matter to her. I'm nothing to Mrs. Osmond. But, if you want to know, I do want to see her myself." "Yes, and that's why you go." "Of course it is. Could there be a better reason?" "How will it help you? That's what I want to know," said Miss Stackpole. "That's just what I can't tell you. It's just what I was thinking about in Paris." "It will make you more discontented." "Why do you say 'more' so?" Goodwood asked rather sternly. "How do you know I'm discontented?" "Well," said Henrietta, hesitating a little, "you seem never to have cared for another." "How do you know what I cared for?" he cried with a big blush. "Just now I care to go to Rome." Henrietta looked at him in silence, with a sad yet luminous expression. "Well," she observed at last, "I only wanted to tell you what I think. I had it on my mind. Of course you think it's none of my business. But nothing is any one's business, on that principle." "It's very kind of you. I'm greatly obliged to you for your interest," said Caspar Goodwood. "I shall go to Rome, and I shan't hurt Mrs. Osmond." "You won't hurt her, perhaps. But will you help her? That's the real issue." "Is she in need of help?" he asked slowly, with a penetrating look. "Most women always are," said Henrietta, with conscientious evasiveness, and generalising less hopefully than usual. "If you go to Rome," she added, "I hope you'll be a true friend, not a selfish one." and she turned off and began to look at the pictures. Caspar Goodwood let her go, and stood watching her while she wandered round the room. But after a moment he rejoined her. "You've heard something about her there," he then resumed. "I should like to know what you've heard." Henrietta had never prevaricated in her life, and though on this occasion there might have been a fitness in doing so, she decided, after thinking some minutes, to make no superficial exception. "Yes, I've heard," she answered, "but as I don't want you to go to Rome, I won't tell you." "Just as you please. I shall see for myself," he said. Then, inconsistently for him, "You've heard she's unhappy," he added. "Oh, you won't see that!" Henrietta exclaimed. "I hope not. When do you start?" "To-morrow, by the evening train. And you?" Goodwood hung back. He had no desire to make his journey to Rome in Miss Stackpole's company. His indifference to this advantage was not of the same character as Gilbert Osmond's, but it had at this moment an equal distinctness. It was rather a tribute to Miss Stackpole's virtues than a reference to her faults. He thought her very remarkable, very brilliant, and he had, in theory, no objection to the class to which she belonged. Lady correspondents appeared to him a part of the natural scheme of things in a progressive country, and though he never read their letters, he supposed that they ministered somehow to social prosperity. But it was this very eminence of their position that made him wish Miss Stackpole didn't take so much for granted. She took for granted that he was always ready for some allusion to Mrs. Osmond. She had done so when they met in Paris 6 weeks after his arrival in Europe, and she had repeated the assumption with every successive opportunity. He had no wish whatever to allude to Mrs. Osmond. He was not always thinking of her. He was perfectly sure of that. He was the most reserved, the least colloquial of men, and this inquiring authoress was constantly flashing her lantern into the quiet darkness of his soul. He wished she didn't care so much. He even wished, though it might seem rather brutal of him, that she would leave him alone. In spite of this, however, he just now made other reflections, which show how widely different, in effect, his ill humour was from Gilbert Osmond's. He desired to go immediately to Rome. He would have liked to go alone in the night train. He hated the European railway carriages, in which one sat for hours in a vice, knee to knee and nose to nose, with a foreigner to whom one presently found oneself objecting with all the added vehemence of one's wish to have the window open; and if they were worse at night even than by day, at least at night one could sleep and dream of an American saloon car. But he couldn't take a night train when Miss Stackpole was starting in the morning. It struck him that this would be an insult to an unprotected woman. Nor could he wait until after she had gone, unless he should wait longer than he had patience for. It wouldn't do to start the next day. She worried him. She oppressed him. The idea of spending the day in a European railway carriage with her offered a complication of irritations. Still, she was a lady travelling alone. It was his duty to put himself out for her. There could be no two questions about that. It was a perfectly clear necessity. He looked extremely grave for some moments, and then said, wholly without the flourish of gallantry, but in a tone of extreme distinctness, "Of course, if you're going to-morrow, I'll go too, as I may be of assistance to you." "Well, Mr. Goodwood, I should hope so," Henrietta returned imperturbably. Chapter 45. Chapters 45 and 46 of The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 45. I have already had reason to say that Isabel knew her husband to be displeased by the continuance of Ralph's visit to Rome. That knowledge was very present to her as she went to her cousin's hotel the day after she had invited Lord Warburton to give a tangible proof of his sincerity; and at this moment, as at others, she had a sufficient perception of the sources of Osmond's opposition. He wished her to have no freedom of mind, and he knew perfectly well that Ralph was an apostle of freedom. It was just because he was this, Isabel said to herself, that it was a refreshment to go and see him. It will be perceived that she partook of this refreshment in spite of her husband's aversion to it; that is, partook of it, as she flattered herself, discreetly. She had not as yet undertaken to act in direct opposition to his wishes. He was her appointed and inscribed master. She waited at moments with a sort of incredulous blankness at this fact. It weighed upon her imagination, however. Constantly present to her mind were all the traditionary decencies and sanctities of marriage. The idea of violating them filled her with shame as well as with dread, for on giving herself away she had lost sight of this contingency in the perfect belief that her husband's intentions were as generous as her own. She seemed to see, none the less, the rapid approach of the day when she should have to take back something she had solemnly bestowed. Such a ceremony would be odious and monstrous. She tried to shut her eyes to it meanwhile. Osmond would do nothing to help it by beginning first. He would put that burden upon her to the end. He had not yet formally forbidden her to call upon Ralph, but she felt sure that unless Ralph should very soon depart, this prohibition would come. How could poor Ralph depart? The weather as yet made it impossible. She could perfectly understand her husband's wish for the event. She didn't, to be just, see how he could like her to be with her cousin. Ralph never said a word against him, but Osmond's sore mute protest was none the less founded. If he should positively interpose, if he should put forth his authority, she would have to decide, and that wouldn't be easy. The prospect made her heart beat and her cheeks burn, as I say in advance. There were moments when in her wish to avoid an open rupture she found herself wishing Ralph would start even at a risk. And it was of no use that, when catching herself in this state of mind, she called herself a feeble spirit, a coward. It was not that she loved Ralph less, but that almost anything seemed preferable to repudiating the most serious act, the single sacred act of her life. That appeared to make the whole future hideous. To break with Osmond once would be to break for ever. Any open acknowledgment of irreconcilable needs would be an admission that their whole attempt had proved a failure. For them there could be no condonement, no compromise, no easy forgetfulness, no formal readjustment. They had attempted only one thing, but that one thing was to have been exquisite. Once they missed it, nothing else would do. There was no conceivable substitute for that success. For the moment Isabel went to the Hôtel de Paris as often as she thought well. The measure of propriety was in the canon of taste, and there couldn't have been a better proof that morality was, so to speak, a matter of earnest appreciation. Isabel's application of that measure had been particularly free to day, for in addition to the general truth that she couldn't leave Ralph to die alone, she had something important to ask of him. This indeed was Gilbert's business as well as her own. She came very soon to what she wished to speak of. "I want you to answer me a question. It's about Lord Warburton." "I think I guess your question," Ralph answered from his armchair, out of which his thin legs protruded at a greater length than ever. "Very possibly you can guess it. Please then answer it." "Oh, I don't say I can do that." "You're intimate with him," she said. "You've a great deal of observation of him." "Very true. But think how he must dissimulate." "Why should he dissimulate? That's not his nature." "Ah, you must remember that the circumstances are peculiar," said Ralph with an air of private amusement. "To a certain extent, yes. But is he really in love?" "Very much, I think. I can make that out." "Ah," said Isabel with a certain dryness. Ralph looked at her as if his mild hilarity had been touched with mystification. "You say that as if you were disappointed." Isabel got up, slowly smoothing her gloves and eyeing them thoughtfully. "It's after all no business of mine." "You're very philosophic," said her cousin. And then in a moment, "May I inquire what you're talking about?" Isabel stared. "I thought you knew. Lord Warburton tells me he wants, of all things in the world, to marry Pansy. I've told you that before without eliciting a comment from you. You might risk one this morning, I think. Is it your belief that he really cares for her?" "Ah, for Pansy, no!" cried Ralph very positively. "But you said just now he did." Ralph waited a moment. "That he cared for you, Mrs. Osmond." Isabel shook her head gravely. "That's nonsense, you know." "Of course it is. But the nonsense is Warburton's, not mine." "That would be very tiresome." She spoke, as she flattered herself, with much subtlety. "I ought to tell you indeed," Ralph went on, "that to me he has denied it." "It's very good of you to talk about it together. Has he also told you that he's in love with Pansy?" "He has spoken very well of her, very properly. He has let me know, of course, that he thinks she would do very well at Lockleigh." "Does he really think it?" "Ah, what Warburton really thinks," said Ralph. Isabel fell to smoothing her gloves again. They were long loose gloves on which she could freely expend herself. Soon, however, she looked up, and then, "Ah, Ralph, you give me no help!" she cried abruptly and passionately. It was the first time she had alluded to the need for help, and the words shook her cousin with their violence. He gave a long murmur of relief, of pity, of tenderness. It seemed to him that at last the gulf between them had been bridged. It was this that made him exclaim in a moment, "How unhappy you must be!" He had no sooner spoken than she recovered her self-possession, and the first use she made of it was to pretend she had not heard him. "When I talk of your helping me, I talk great nonsense," she said with a quick smile. "The idea of my troubling you with my domestic embarrassments! The matter's very simple. Lord Warburton must get on by himself. I can't undertake to see him through." "He ought to succeed easily," said Ralph. Isabel debated. "Yes, but he has not always succeeded." "Very true. You know, however, how that always surprised me. Is Miss Osmond capable of giving us a surprise?" "It will come from him rather. I seem to see that after all he'll let the matter drop." "He'll do nothing dishonourable," said Ralph. "I'm very sure of that. Nothing can be more honourable than for him to leave the poor child alone. She cares for another person, and it's cruel to attempt to bribe her by magnificent offers to give him up." "Cruel to the other person, perhaps, the one she cares for. But Warburton isn't obliged to mind that." "No, cruel to her," said Isabel. "She would be very unhappy if she were to allow herself to be persuaded to desert poor Mr. Rozier. That idea seems to amuse you. Of course you're not in love with him. He has the merit, for Pansy, of being in love with Pansy. She can see at a glance that Lord Warburton isn't." "He'd be very good to her," said Ralph. "He has been good to her already. Fortunately, however, he has not said a word to disturb her. He could come and bid her good-bye to morrow with perfect propriety." "How would your husband like that?" "Not at all, and he may be right in not liking it. Only he must obtain satisfaction himself." "Has he commissioned you to obtain it?" Ralph ventured to ask. It was natural that as an old friend of Lord Warburton's, an older friend, that is, than Gilbert, I should take an interest in his intentions. "Take an interest in his renouncing them, you mean?" Isabel hesitated, frowning a little. "Let me understand. Are you pleading his cause?" "Not in the least. I'm very glad he shouldn't become your stepdaughter's husband. It makes such a very queer relation to you," said Ralph, smiling. "But I'm rather nervous lest your husband should think you haven't pushed him enough." Isabel found herself able to smile as well as he. "He knows me well enough not to have expected me to push. He himself has no intention of pushing, I presume. I'm not afraid I shall not be able to justify myself," she said lightly. Her mask had dropped for an instant, but she had put it on again, to Ralph's infinite disappointment. He had caught a glimpse of her natural face, and he wished immensely to look into it. He had an almost savage desire to hear her complain of her husband, hear her say that she should be held accountable for Lord Warburton's defection. Ralph was certain that this was her situation. He knew by instinct, in advance, the form that in such an event Osman's displeasure would take. It could only take the meanest and cruellest. He would have liked to warn Isabel of it, to let her see at least how he judged for her and how he knew. It little mattered that Isabel would know much better. It was for his own satisfaction more than for hers that he longed to show her he was not deceived. He tried and tried again to make her betray Osmond. He felt cold-blooded, cruel, dishonourable almost in doing so. But it scarcely mattered, for he only failed. What had she come for then, and why did she seem almost to offer him a chance to violate their tacit convention? Why did she ask him his advice, if she gave him no liberty to answer her? How could they talk of her domestic embarrassments, as it pleased her humorously to designate them, if the principal factor was not to be mentioned? These contradictions were themselves but an indication of her trouble, and her cry for help just before was the only thing he was bound to consider. "You'll be decidedly at variance all the same," he said in a moment. And, as she answered nothing, looking as if she scarce understood, "You'll find yourselves thinking very differently," he continued. "That may easily happen among the most united couples." She took up her parasol. He saw she was nervous, afraid of what he might say. "It's a matter we can hardly quarrel about, however," she added, "for almost all the interest is on his side. That's very natural. Pansy's after all his daughter, not mine." And she put out her hand to wish him good-bye. Ralph took an inward resolution that she shouldn't leave him without his letting her know that he knew everything. It seemed too great an opportunity to lose. "Do you know what his interest will make him say?" he asked as he took her hand. She shook her head rather dryly, not discouragingly, and he went on. "It will make him say that your want of zeal is owing to jealousy." He stopped a moment. Her face made him afraid. "To jealousy?" "To jealousy of his daughter." She blushed red and threw back her head. "You're not kind," she said, in a voice that he had never heard on her lips. "Be frank with me and you'll see," he answered. But she made no reply. She only pulled her hand out of his own, which he tried still to hold, and rapidly withdrew from the room. She made up her mind to speak to Pansy, and she took an occasion on the same day, going to the girl's room before dinner. Pansy was already dressed. She was always in advance of the time. It seemed to illustrate her pretty patience and the graceful stillness with which she could sit and wait. At present she was seated, in her fresh array, before the bedroom fire. She had blown out her candles on the completion of her toilet, in accordance with the economical habits in which she had been brought up, and which she was now more careful than ever to observe, so that the room was lighted only by a couple of logs. The rooms in Palazzo Roccanera were as spacious as they were numerous, and Pansy's virginal bower was an immense chamber with a dark heavily timbered ceiling. Its diminutive mistress, in the midst of it, appeared but a speck of humanity, and as she got up with quick deference to welcome Isabel, the latter was more than ever struck with her shy sincerity. Isabel had a difficult task. The only thing was to perform it as simply as possible. She felt bitter and angry, but she warned herself against betraying this heat. She was afraid even of looking too grave, or at least too stern. She was afraid of causing alarm. But Pansy seemed to have guessed she had come more or less as a confessor, for after she had moved the chair in which she had been sitting a little nearer to the fire, and Isabel had taken her place in it, she kneeled down on a cushion in front of her, looking up and resting her clasped hands on her stepmother's knees. What Isabel wished to do was to hear from her own lips that her mind was not occupied with Lord Warburton, but if she desired the assurance, she felt herself by no means at liberty to provoke it. The girl's father would have qualified this as rank treachery, and indeed Isabel knew that if Pansy should display the smallest germ of a disposition to encourage Lord Warburton, her own duty was to hold her tongue. It was difficult to interrogate without appearing to suggest. Pansy's supreme simplicity, an innocence even more complete than Isabel had yet judged it, gave to the most tentative inquiry something of the effect of an admonition. As she knelt there in the vague firelight, with her pretty dress dimly shining, her hands folded half in appeal and half in submission, her soft eyes raised and fixed, full of the seriousness of the situation, she looked to Isabel like a childish martyr decked out for sacrifice and scarcely presuming even to hope to avert it. When Isabel said to her she had never yet spoken to her of what might have been going on in relation to her getting married, but that her silence had not been indifference or ignorance, had only been the desire to leave her at liberty, Pansy bent forward, raised her face nearer and nearer, and with a little murmur which evidently expressed a deep longing, answered that she had greatly wished her to speak, and that she begged her to advise her now. "It's difficult for me to advise you," Isabel returned. "I don't know how I can undertake that. That's for your father. You must get his advice, and above all you must act on it." At this Pansy dropped her eyes. For a moment she said nothing. "I think I should like your advice better than papa's," she presently remarked. "That's not as it should be," said Isabel coldly. "I love you very much, but your father loves you better." "It isn't because you love me, it's because you're a lady," Pansy answered, with the air of saying something very reasonable. "A lady can advise a young girl better than a man." "I advise you to pay the greatest respect to your father's wishes." "Ah, yes," said the child eagerly, "I must do that." "But if I speak to you now about your getting married, it's not for your own sake, it's for mine," Isabel went on. "If I try to learn from you what you expect, what you desire, it's only that I may act accordingly." Pansy stared, and then very quickly, "Will you do everything I want?" she asked. "Before I say yes, I must know what such things are." Pansy presently told her that the only thing she wanted in life was to marry Mr. Rozier. He had asked her, and she had told him she would do so if her papa would allow it. Now her papa wouldn't allow it. "Very well, then, it's impossible," Isabel pronounced. "Yes, it's impossible," said Pansy, without a sigh and with the same extreme attention in her clear little face. "You must think of something else, then," Isabel went on; but Pansy, sighing at this, told her that she had attempted that feat without the least success. "You think of those who think of you," she said with a faint smile. "I know Mr. Rozier thinks of me." "He ought not to," said Isabel loftily. "Your father has expressly requested he shouldn't." "He can't help it, because he knows I think of him." "You shouldn't think of him. There's some excuse for him, perhaps, but there's none for you." "I wish you would try to find one," the girl exclaimed, as if she were praying to the Madonna. "I should be very sorry to attempt it," said the Madonna, with unusual frigidity. "If you knew some one else was thinking of you, would you think of him?" "No one can think of me as Mr. Rozier does. No one has the right." "Ah, but I don't admit Mr. Rose's right," Isabel hypocritically cried. Pansy only gazed at her, evidently much puzzled, and Isabel, taking advantage of it, began to represent to her the wretched consequences of disobeying her father. At this Pansy stopped her with the assurance that she would never disobey him, would never marry without his consent, and she announced in the serenest, simplest tone that though she might never marry Mr. Roser, she would never cease to think of him. She appeared to have accepted the idea of eternal singleness. But Isabel, of course, was free to reflect that she had no conception of its meaning. She was perfectly sincere. She was prepared to give up her lover. This might seem an important step toward taking another, but for Pansy, evidently, it failed to lead in that direction. She felt no bitterness toward her father. There was no bitterness in her heart. There was only the sweetness of fidelity to Edward Roser, and a strange, exquisite intimation that she could prove it better by remaining single than even by marrying him. "Your father would like you to make a better marriage," said Isabel. "Mr. Roser's fortune is not at all large." "How do you mean better? If that would be good enough? And I have myself so little money. Why should I look for a fortune?" "Your having so little is a reason for looking for more." With which Isabel was grateful for the dimness of the room. She felt as if her face were hideously insincere. It was what she was doing for Osmond. It was what one had to do for Osmond. Pansy's solemn eyes, fixed on her own, almost embarrassed her. She was ashamed to think she had made so light of the girl's preference. "What should you like me to do?" her companion softly demanded. The question was a terrible one, and Isabel took refuge in timorous vagueness. "To remember all the pleasure it's in your power to give your father." "To marry some one else, you mean, if he should ask me?" For a moment Isabel's answer caused itself to be waited for. Then she heard herself utter it in the stillness that Pansy's attention seemed to make. "Yes, to marry some one else." The child's eyes grew more penetrating. Isabel believed she was doubting her sincerity, and the impression took force from her slowly getting up from her cushion. She stood there a moment with her small hands unclasped, and then quavered out, "Well, I hope no one will ask me." "There has been a question of that. Some one else would have been ready to ask you." "I don't think he can have been ready," said Pansy. "It would appear so, if he had been sure he'd succeed." "If he had been sure? Then he wasn't ready." Isabel thought this rather sharp. She also got up and stood a moment looking into the fire. "Lord Warburton has shown you great attention," she resumed. "Of course you know it's of him I speak." She found herself, against her expectation, almost placed in the position of justifying herself, which led her to introduce this nobleman more crudely than she had intended. "He has been very kind to me, and I like him very much. But if you mean that he'll propose for me, I think you're mistaken." "Perhaps I am, but your father would like it extremely." Pansy shook her head with a little wise smile. "Lord Warburton wouldn't propose simply to please papa." "Your father would like you to encourage him," Isabel went on mechanically. "How can I encourage him?" "I don't know. Your father must tell you that." Pansy said nothing for a moment. She only continued to smile, as if she were in possession of a bright assurance. "There's no danger, no danger," she declared at last. There was a conviction in the way she said this, and a felicity in her believing it, which conduced to Isabel's awkwardness. She felt accused of dishonesty, and the idea was disgusting. To repair her self-respect, she was on the point of saying that Lord Warburton had let her know that there was a danger. But she didn't. She only said, in her embarrassment rather wide of the mark, that he surely had been most kind, most friendly. "Yes, he has been very kind," Pansy answered. "That's what I like him for." "Why, then, is the difficulty so great?" "I've always felt sure of his knowing that I don't want what did you say I should do? To encourage him. He knows I don't want to marry, and he wants me to know that he therefore won't trouble me. That's the meaning of his kindness. It's as if he said to me, 'I like you very much, but if it doesn't please you I'll never say it again.' I think that's very kind, very noble," Pansy went on, with deepening positiveness. "That is all we've said to each other. And he doesn't care for me either. Ah, no, there's no danger." Isabel was touched with wonder at the depths of perception of which this submissive little person was capable. She felt afraid of Pansy's wisdom, began almost to retreat before it. "You must tell your father that," she remarked reservedly. "I think I'd rather not," Pansy unreservedly answered. "You oughtn't to let him have false hopes." "Perhaps not, but it will be good for me that he should. So long as he believes that Lord Warburton intends anything of the kind you say, papa won't propose any one else. And that will be an advantage for me," said the child very lucidly. There was something brilliant in her lucidity, and it made her companion draw a long breath. It relieved this friend of a heavy responsibility. Pansy had a sufficient illumination of her own, and Isabel felt that she herself just now had no light to spare from her small stock. Nevertheless it still clung to her that she must be loyal to Osmond, that she was on her honour in dealing with his daughter. Under the influence of this sentiment she threw out another suggestion before she retired, a suggestion with which it seemed to her that she should have done her utmost. "Your father takes for granted at least that you would like to marry a nobleman." Pansy stood in the doorway. She had drawn back the curtain for Isabel to pass. "I think Mr. Rozier looks like one," she remarked very gravely. Chapter 46. Lord Warburton was not seen in Mrs. Osmond's drawing room for several days, and Isabel couldn't fail to observe that her husband said nothing to her about having received a letter from him. She couldn't fail to observe either that Osmond was in a state of expectancy, and that though it was not agreeable to him to betray it, he thought their distinguished friend kept him waiting quite too long. At the end of 4 days he alluded to his absence. "What has become of Warburton? What does he mean by treating me like a tradesman with a bill?" "I know nothing about him," Isabel said. "I saw him last Friday at the German ball. He told me then that he meant to write to you." "He has never written to me." "So I supposed, from your not having told me." "He's an odd fish," said Osmond comprehensively; and on Isabel's making no rejoinder he went on to inquire whether it took his lordship 5 days to indite a letter. "Does he form his words with such difficulty?" "I don't know," Isabel was reduced to replying. "I've never had a letter from him." "Never had a letter? I had an idea that you were at one time in intimate correspondence." She answered that this had not been the case, and let the conversation drop. On the morrow, however, coming into the drawing room late in the afternoon, her husband took it up again. "When Lord Warburton told you of his intention of writing, what did you say to him?" he asked. She just faltered. "I think I told him not to forget it." "Did you believe that there was a danger of that?" "As you say, he's an odd fish." "Apparently he has forgotten it," said Osmond. "Be so good as to remind him." "Should you like me to write to him?" she demanded. "I've no objection whatever." "You expect too much of me." "Ah, yes, I expect a great deal of you." "I'm afraid I shall disappoint you," said Isabel. "My expectations have survived a good deal of disappointment." "Of course I know that. Think how I must have disappointed myself. If you really wish hands laid on Lord Warburton, You must lay them yourself." For a couple of minutes Osmond answered nothing. Then he said, "That won't be easy with you working against me." Isabel started. She felt herself beginning to tremble. He had a way of looking at her through half closed eyelids, as if he were thinking of her but scarcely saw her, which seemed to her to have a wonderfully cruel intention. It appeared to recognise her as a disagreeable necessity of thought, but to ignore her for the time as a presence. That effect had never been so marked as now. "I think you accuse me of something very base," she returned. "I accuse you of not being trustworthy. If he doesn't after all come forward it will be because you've kept him off. I don't know that it's base. It is the kind of thing a woman always thinks she may do. I've no doubt you have the finest ideas about it." "I told you I would do what I could," she went on. "Yes, that gained you time." It came over her, after he had said this, that she had once thought him beautiful. "How much you must want to make sure of him!" she exclaimed in a moment. She had no sooner spoken than she perceived the full reach of her words, of which she had not been conscious in uttering them. They made a comparison between Osmond and herself, recalled the fact that she had once held this coveted treasure in her hand and felt herself rich enough to let it fall. A momentary exultation took possession of her, a horrible delight in having wounded him, for his face instantly told her that none of the force of her exclamation was lost. He expressed nothing otherwise, however. He only said quickly, "Yes, I want it immensely." At this moment a servant came in to usher a visitor, and he was followed the next by Lord Warburton, who received a visible check on seeing Osmond. He looked rapidly from the master of the house to the mistress, a movement that seemed to denote a reluctance to interrupt or even a perception of ominous conditions. Then he advanced, with his English address, in which a vague shyness seemed to offer itself as an element of good breeding, in which the only defect was a difficulty in achieving transitions. Osmond was embarrassed. He found nothing to say, but Isabel remarked, promptly enough, that they had been in the act of talking about their visitor. Upon this her husband added that they hadn't known what was become of him. They had been afraid he had gone away. "No," he explained, smiling and looking at Osmond. "I'm only on the point of going." And then he mentioned that he had found himself suddenly recalled to England. He should start on the morrow or the day after. "I'm awfully sorry to leave poor Touchett," he ended by exclaiming. For a moment neither of his companions spoke. Osmond only leaned back in his chair listening. Isabel didn't look at him. She could only fancy how he looked. Her eyes were on their visitor's face, where they were the more free to rest that those of his lordship carefully avoided them. Yet Isabel was sure that had she met his glance she would have found it expressive. "You had better take poor Touchett with you," she heard her husband say, lightly enough, in a moment. "He had better wait for warmer weather," Lord Warburton answered. "I shouldn't advise him to travel just now." He sat there a quarter of an hour, talking as if he might not soon see them again, unless indeed they should come to England, a course he strongly recommended. Why shouldn't they come to England in the autumn? That struck him as a very happy thought. It would give him such pleasure to do what he could for them, to have them come and spend a month with him. Osmond, by his own admission, had been to England but once, which was an absurd state of things for a man of his leisure and intelligence. It was just the country for him. He would be sure to get on well there. Then Lord Warburton asked Isabel if she remembered what a good time she had had there, and if she didn't want to try it again. Didn't she want to see Gardencourt once more? Gardencourt was really very good. Touchett didn't take the proper care of it, but it was the sort of place you could hardly spoil by letting it alone. Why didn't they come and pay Touchett a visit? He surely must have asked them. Hadn't asked them? What an ill-mannered wretch! And Lord Warburton promised to give the master of Gardencourt a piece of his mind. Of course it was a mere accident. He would be delighted to have them. Spending a month with Touchett and a month with himself, and seeing all the rest of the people they must know there, they really wouldn't find it half bad. Lord Warburton added that it would amuse Miss Osmond as well, who had told him that she had never been to England, and whom he had assured it was a country she deserved to see. Of course she didn't need to go to England to be admired. That was her fate everywhere. But she would be an immense success there, she certainly would, if that was any inducement. He asked if she were not at home, couldn't he say good-bye? Not that he liked good-byes, he always funked them. When he left England the other day he hadn't said good-bye to a two-legged creature. He had had half a mind to leave Rome without troubling Mrs. Osmond for a final interview. What could be more dreary than final interviews? One never said the things one wanted. One remembered them all an hour afterwards. On the other hand, one usually said a lot of things one shouldn't, simply from a sense that one had to say something. Such a sense was upsetting. It muddled one's wits. He had it at present, and that was the effect it produced on him. If Mrs. Osmond didn't think he spoke as he ought, she must set it down to agitation. It was no light thing to part with Mrs. Osmond. He was really very sorry to be going. He had thought of writing to her instead of calling, but he would write to her at any rate to tell her a lot of things that would be sure to occur to him as soon as he had left the house. They must think seriously about coming to Lochley. If there was anything awkward in the conditions of his visit, or in the announcement of his departure, it failed to come to the surface. Lord Warburton talked about his agitation, but he showed it in no other manner, and Isabel saw that since he had determined on a retreat, he was capable of executing it gallantly. She was very glad for him. She liked him quite well enough to wish him to appear to carry a thing off. He would do that on any occasion, not from impudence, but simply from the habit of success. And Isabel felt it out of her husband's power to frustrate this faculty. A complex operation, as she sat there, went on in her mind. On one side she listened to their visitor, said what was proper to him, read more or less between the lines of what he said himself, and wondered how he would have spoken if he had found her alone. On the other she had a perfect consciousness of Osmond's emotion. She felt almost sorry for him. He was condemned to the sharp pain of loss without the relief of cursing. He had had a great hope, and now, as he saw it vanish into smoke, he was obliged to sit and smile and twirl his thumbs. Not that he troubled himself to smile very brightly. He treated their friend on the whole to as vacant a countenance as so clever a man could very well wear. It was indeed a part of Osmond's cleverness that he could look consummately uncompromised. His present appearance, however, was not a confession of disappointment. It was simply a part of Osmond's habitual system, which was to be inexpressive exactly in proportion as he was really intent. He had been intent on this prize from the first, but he had never allowed his eagerness to irradiate his refined face. He had treated his possible son-in-law as he treated every one, with an air of being interested in him only for his own advantage, not for any profit to a person already so generally, so perfectly provided as Gilbert Osmond. He would give no sign now of an inward rage, which was the result of any vanished prospect of gain, not the faintest nor the subtlest. Isabel could be sure of that, if it was any satisfaction to her. Strangely, very strangely, it was a satisfaction. She wished Lord Warburton to triumph before her husband, and at the same time she wished her husband to be very superior before Lord Warburton. Osmond, in his way, was admirable. He had, like their visitor, the advantage of an acquired habit. It was not that of succeeding, but it was something almost as good, that of not attempting. As he leaned back in his place, listening but vaguely to the other's friendly offers and suppressed explanations, as if it were only proper to assume that they were addressed essentially to his wife, he had at least, since so little else was left him, the comfort of thinking how well he personally had kept out of it, and how the air of indifference, which he was now able to wear, had the added beauty of consistency. It was something to be able to look as if the leave-taker's movements had no relation to his own mind. The latter did well, certainly, but Osmond's performance was in its very nature more finished. Lord Warburton's position was, after all, an easy one. There was no reason in the world why he shouldn't leave Rome. He had had beneficent inclinations, but they had stopped short of fruition. He had never committed himself, and his honour was safe. Osmond appeared to take but a moderate interest in the proposal that they should go and stay with him, and in his allusions to the success Pansy might extract from their visit. He murmured a recognition, but left Isabel to say that it was a matter requiring grave consideration. Isabel, even while she made this remark, could see the great vista which had suddenly opened out in her husband's mind, with Pansy's little figure marching up the middle of it. Lord Warburton had asked leave to bid good-bye to Pansy, but neither Isabel nor Osmond had made any motion to send for her. He had the air of giving out that his visit must be short. He sat on a small chair, as if it were only for a moment, keeping his hat in his hand. But he stayed and stayed. Isabel wondered what he was waiting for. She believed it was not to see Pansy. She had an impression that on the whole he would rather not see Pansy. It was, of course, to see herself alone. He had something to say to her. Isabel had no great wish to hear it, for she was afraid it would be an explanation, and she could perfectly well dispense with explanations. Osmond, however, presently got up, like a man of good taste, to whom it had occurred that so inveterate a visitor might wish to say just the last word of all to the ladies. "I've a letter to write before dinner," he said. "You must excuse me. I'll see if my daughter's disengaged, and if she is, she shall know you're here. Of course, when you come to Rome you'll always look us up. Mrs. Osmond will talk to you about the English expedition. She decides all those things." The nod with which, instead of a handshake, he wound up this little speech was perhaps rather a meagre form of salutation, but on the whole it was all the occasion demanded. Isabel reflected that after he left the room Lord Warburton would have no pretext for saying, "Your husband's very angry," which would have been extremely disagreeable to her. Nevertheless, if he had done so, she would have said, "Oh, don't be anxious, he doesn't hate you, it's me that he hates." It was only when they had been left alone together that her friend showed a certain vague awkwardness, sitting down in another chair, handling 2 or 3 of the objects that were near him. "I hope he'll make Miss Osmond come," he presently remarked. "I want very much to see her." "I'm glad it's the last time," said Isabel. "So am I. She doesn't care for me." "No, she doesn't care for you." "I don't wonder at it," he returned. Then he added with inconsequence, "You'll come to England, won't you?" "I think we had better not." "Ah, you owe me a visit. Don't you remember that you were to have come to Lochley once, and you never did?" "Everything's changed since then," said Isabel. "Not changed for the worse, surely, as far as we're concerned. To see you under my roof," and he hung fire but an instant, "would be a great satisfaction." She had feared an explanation, but that was the only one that occurred. They talked a little of Ralph, and in another moment Pansy came in, already dressed for dinner, and with a little red spot in either cheek. She shook hands with Lord Warburton, and stood looking up into his face with a fixed smile, a smile that Isabel knew, though his lordship probably never suspected it, to be near akin to a burst of tears. "I'm going away," he said. "I want to bid you good-bye." "Good-bye, Lord Warburton." Her voice perceptibly trembled. "And I want to tell you how much I wish you may be very happy." "Thank you, Lord Warburton," Pansy answered. He lingered a moment and gave a glance at Isabel. "You ought to be very happy. You've got a guardian angel." "I'm sure I shall be happy," said Pansy, in the tone of a person whose certainties were always cheerful. Such a conviction as that will take you a great way. But if it should ever fail you, remember—' and her interlocutor stammered a little. 'Think of me sometimes, you know,' he said with a vague laugh. Then he shook hands with Isabel in silence, and presently he was gone. When he had left the room she expected an effusion of tears from her stepdaughter, but Pansy in fact treated her to something very different. 'I think you are my guardian angel,' she exclaimed very sweetly. Isabel shook her head. 'I'm not an angel of any kind. I'm at the most your good friend.' 'You're a very good friend, then, to have asked papa to be gentle with me?' 'I've asked your father nothing,' said Isabel, wondering. 'He told me just now to come to the drawing room, and then he gave me a very kind kiss.' 'Ah,' said Isabel, 'that was quite his own idea.' She recognised the idea perfectly. It was very characteristic, and she was to see a great deal more of it. Even with Pansy he couldn't put himself the least in the wrong. They were dining out that day, and after their dinner they went to another entertainment, so that it was not till late in the evening that Isabel saw him alone. When Pansy kissed him before going to bed, he returned her embrace with even more than his usual munificence, and Isabel wondered if he meant it as a hint that his daughter had been injured by the machinations of her stepmother. It was a partial expression, at any rate, of what he continued to expect of his wife. She was about to follow Pansy, but he remarked that he wished she would remain. He had something to say to her. Then he walked about the drawing room a little, while she stood waiting in her cloak. 'I don't understand what you wish to do,' he said in a moment. 'I should like to know, so that I may know how to act.' 'Just now I wish to go to bed. I'm very tired.' 'Sit down and rest. I shall not keep you long. Not there. Take a comfortable place.' And he arranged a multitude of cushions that were scattered in picturesque disorder upon a vast divan. This was not, however, where she seated herself. She dropped into the nearest chair. The fire had gone out. The lights in the great room were few. She drew her cloak about her. She felt mortally cold. 'I think you're trying to humiliate me,' Osmond went on. 'It's a most absurd undertaking.' 'I haven't the least idea what you mean,' she returned. 'You've played a very deep game. You've managed it beautifully.' 'What is it that I've managed?' 'You've not quite settled it? However, we shall see him again.' And he stopped in front of her, with his hands in his pockets, looking down at her thoughtfully in his usual way, which seemed meant to let her know that she was not an object, but only a rather disagreeable incident of thought. 'If you mean that Lord Warburton's under an obligation to come back, you're wrong,' Isabel said. 'He's under none whatever.' 'That's just what I complain of. But when I say he'll come back, I don't mean he'll come back from a sense of duty.' 'There's nothing else to make him. I think he has quite exhausted Rome.' 'Ah, no, that's a shallow judgment. Rome's inexhaustible.' And Osmond began to walk about again. 'However, about that perhaps there's no hurry,' he added. 'It's rather a good idea of his that we should go to England. If it were not for the fear of finding your cousin there, I think I should try to persuade you.' 'It may be that you'll not find my cousin,' said Isabel. 'I should like to be sure of it. However, I shall be as sure as possible. At the same time I should like to see his house, that you told me so much about at one time. What do you call it? Garden Court. It must be a charming thing. And then, you know, I've a devotion to the memory of your uncle. You made me take a great fancy to him. I should like to see where he lived and died. That indeed is a detail. Your friend was right. Pansy ought to see England.' 'I've no doubt she would enjoy it,' said Isabel. 'But that's a long time hence. Next autumn's far off,' Osmond continued. 'And meantime there are things that more nearly interest us. Do you think me so very proud?' he suddenly asked. 'I think you very strange.' 'You don't understand me.' 'No, not even when you insult me.' 'I don't insult you. I'm incapable of it. I merely speak of certain facts, and if the allusion's an injury to you, the fault's not mine. It's surely a fact that you have kept all this matter quite in your own hands." "Are you going back to Lord Warburton?" Isabel asked. "I'm very tired of his name." "You shall hear it again before we've done with it." She had spoken of his insulting her, but it suddenly seemed to her that this ceased to be a pain. He was going down, down. The vision of such a fall made her almost giddy. That was the only pain. He was too strange, too different. He didn't touch her. Still the working of his morbid passion was extraordinary, and she felt a rising curiosity to know in what light he saw himself justified. "I might say to you that I judge you've nothing to say to me that's worth hearing," she returned in a moment. "But I should perhaps be wrong. There's a thing that would be worth my hearing, to know in the plainest words of what it is you accuse me." "Of having prevented Pansy's marriage to Warburton. Are those words plain enough?" "On the contrary, I took a great interest in it. I told you so, and when you told me that you counted on me, that I think was what you said, I accepted the obligation. I was a fool to do so, but I did it." "You pretended to do it, and you even pretended reluctance to make me more willing to trust you. Then you began to use your ingenuity to get him out of the way." "I think I see what you mean," said Isabel. "Where's the letter you told me he had written me?" her husband demanded. "I haven't the least idea. I haven't asked him." "You've stopped it on the way," said Osmond. Isabel slowly got up. Standing there in her white cloak, which covered her to her feet, she might have represented the angel of disdain, first cousin to that of pity. "Oh, Gilbert, for a man who was so fine!" she exclaimed in a long murmur. "I was never so fine as you. You've done everything you wanted. You've got him out of the way without appearing to do so, and you've placed me in the position in which you wish to see me, that of a man who has tried to marry his daughter to a lord, but has grotesquely failed." "Pansy doesn't care for him. She's very glad he's gone," Isabel said. "That has nothing to do with the matter." "And he doesn't care for Pansy." "That won't do. You told me he did. I don't know why you wanted this particular satisfaction," Osmond continued. "You might have taken some other. It doesn't seem to me that I've been presumptuous, that I have taken too much for granted. I've been very modest about it, very quiet. The idea didn't originate with me. He began to show that he liked her before I ever thought of it. I left it all to you." "Yes, you were very glad to leave it to me. After this you must attend to such things yourself." He looked at her a moment, then he turned away. "I thought you were very fond of my daughter." "I've never been more so than to day." "Your affection is attended with immense limitations. However, that perhaps is natural." "Is this all you wish to say to me?" Isabel asked, taking a candle that stood on one of the tables. "Are you satisfied? Am I sufficiently disappointed?" "I don't think that on the whole you're disappointed. You've had another opportunity to try to stupefy me." "It's not that. It's proved that Pansy can aim high." "Poor little Pansy," said Isabel as she turned away with her candle. Chapter 47